From Michael Morley's handwritten account dated 1974, I broke into 3 different places over the next 2 nights. Having climbed with creeping stealth out of my own bedroom window and escaping into the frozen night air, I found myself, not a half hour later, doing the exact opposite. That time I was climbing in through a window, one that had not been left purposely ajar, but which had rather been pried open by me. My first break-in and the one involving the window was the one at the Moorton Public Library. Since the old Victorian building had one of the collections stored in a huge basement level, the small window for that portion of the building was only around a foot off the ground. Approaching through the small patch of woodland behind the library, a would-be intruder, i.e. me, could slip unnoticed to the back of the building and gain entry. My method for doing this was fairly simple. Using a large rock and a thick branch snapped from a nearby oak tree, I created a lever, a little like a seesaw. I placed the middle of the branch over the rock and the other end under the protruding brass handle at the bottom of the window. By then pushing violently on the other end of the branch, I slowly but surely edged the window up. Laying on my belly in the mud, I managed with some difficulty to slide through the small gap and lower myself into the basement room. Once inside, I turned on the trusty bike lamp I had taken with me on my first excursion and rushed toward the section on folklore. I had been in that basement room many times, searching through books that my teachers said were either too old and advanced for me or on topics that a youngster like myself should not be dwelling on. Luckily, the librarian, Mr. Bates, was far more relaxed when it came to regulating the reading habits of his visitors. As far as he was concerned, a young boy with his nose in a book, any book, was a good thing. Rather than discouraging my interests, he actively went out of his way to support them, bringing in books on loan from other far better stocked libraries in the city, and further afield, just for me, and recommending novels and non-fiction texts that I had never heard of. However, despite my familiarity with the layout of the place, finding my way through the shelves of books, around the desks and past the piles of volumes yet to be organized was no mean feat in the pitch black, nor was it entirely comfortable. Despite Mr. Bates's efforts to make the place more welcoming, even in daylight, the basement room of that old building was never the coziest of places. With its meager lighting and odd, musty stench, a mix of creeping damp and ancient book dust, it was a foreboding space that managed to be somehow icy cold and drafty in the winter and swelteringly hot and stuffy during the summer. In the daylight, it was claustrophobic. At night after a break-in, it was positively suffocating. Perhaps it was the fact that dawn was missing, perhaps the lack of sleep, or the crushing weight laid upon my young imagination by the things I had seen. But every time I lowered my head to read, turning my back on the shelves and the narrow aisles between them, I felt the additional weight of eyes upon my shoulders, as if I was being always watched and was never for a moment alone. I can say now, and will always maintain, that the basement room of the Moorton Library is what might be called an unquiet place. Certainly, it was an uncomfortable spot to be reading by torchlight about men who turn into monsters, but that is what I did. For the next 4 hours, in a feverish rush of frustration and flipped pages, I searched the various volumes looking for any and every reference I could find to werewolves. I read the usual popular stories and legends, Hollywood nonsense and photographs of Lon Chaney Jr. in full makeup. I read about silver bullets, full moons and curses. I skim-read accounts and stories that painted the werewolf as a victim, cursed by a witch or bitten by another of their own kind. But it was the older and more obscure folklore that made my blood turn to ice. For me, researching these kinds of subjects is like following a breadcrumb trail, though in this case it was the big bad wolf, not a witch in a gingerbread house, that was waiting for me at the end. Finding one crumb inevitably leads you to another. A name would lead to another book, a reference in that book to the title of another book, an article or an essay, each step bringing you closer to the answer you were so desperately searching for. In this case, it was a schlocky popular book about vampires and werewolves that was mentioned in a single line. The name Mongatgu Summers. I had heard the name before and decided to look up any other texts by or referencing him. Summers, it should be noted, was an English clergyman and scholar who wrote extensively on the supernatural and the occult, including on the topic of werewolves. Having found transcripts of his lectures, I was led by way of footnotes and references to denser and more obscure volumes containing translations of works by French, Russian, and eventually Scandinavian authors. As I continued to read, moving with every page further from the tropes created for the screen and closer to the older and more authentic werewolf traditions, I came across striking yet far less popular traditions. I read of older beliefs that far predated the invention of silver bullets. The idea, for example, that a cursed werewolf could be cured by way of an exorcism, or that by calling the victim's Christian name 3 times aloud whilst they are in the form of a beast you could release them. I also read that the creature could be killed by striking it with a dagger 3 times on the forehead. I read of famous historical cases, such as that of French teenager Jean Grenier, who, in 1604, claimed to have killed and eaten over 50 children after they transformed into a wolf by means of ritual during which he wore the pelt of a slain wolf. I saw the 1512 woodcut by Lucas Cranach, which showed a werewolf attack, but depicted not a thing with canine features, but a man crawling on all fours through the mauled and ravaged remnants of victims and still carrying a screaming baby in his jaws. I read, for the first time, the idea that some werewolves are not innocent victims, made that way by an attack by another, but are instead willing participants. Humans who, through the use of magical rituals, actually choose to become beasts and feed on human flesh. Men who, it seems, were already monsters long before they transformed. I read of how this could be achieved in a variety of ways, by drinking rainwater from a wolf print, leaping over a fallen tree whilst reciting a certain spell, or stabbing at a fallen elm with a dagger made from copper. I read of how many rituals involved wearing a wolfskin over the naked body and rubbing yourself with an ointment made from, amongst other ingredients, wolfsbane, hyssop, opium, and the fat of a murdered child. It was whilst reading one of these ugly little recipes that I stumbled across the detail that made me freeze. For there, in one of the older texts, was a recipe for an ointment, which, if rubbed on the body by moonlight, purported to turn the one using it by way of some strange magical process into a werewolf. I angled the torch so as to get a better look at the ingredients, tracing my finger over each one in turn, and stopped dead at the final entry, foxglove. According to this text, and to others that I cross-referenced it against, searching in my panic to be sure, I had to be sure, those wishing to become werewolves made use of a plant called foxglove, a plant with a pretty but conspicuous flower that I had seen growing in a garden right here in Moorton. That garden belonged to Mr. Blackwell. For years there had been stories about Thomas Blackwell, of how local kids, when playing football in the street, would never dream of retrieving a lost ball from his garden for fear that he might catch them. So afraid were they of the strange old man and his cruel smile, that a ball that was miskicked over that wall was considered lost forever. I remembered hearing horror stories about Blackwell, how once he had seen a ball fly into his garden and had actually come outside to retrieve it, but instead of passing it back to the boys playing, he had instead stabbed a small knife right through it, deflating the thing in front of them with the words, "Next time, it'll be your head." I could not help wondering whether the knife used to burst that ball might not be a small copper dagger of the type that might be stabbed into a fallen tree during a ritual. Another story, which I only half believed, told of how old Blackwell used to lay traps in his garden to snare birds and small animals. One kid I went to school with called Mikey Ryan swore on his mother's grave that he had seen Blackwell catch a large fat crow in one of these wire snare traps. The poor thing had been hanging upside down from 1 foot all night, and Mikey had been there when Blackwell came out to retrieve it. He gripped it tight round its body, he told me one afternoon in maths, like he was holding a loaf of bread or a sheaf of corn or something, and then he just killed it, right there in front of me. Not by wringing its neck or anything like that. He turned its head with one hand, held it by the beak with the other, and then he bit it. Just a bit down on the back of its neck, and kept biting harder and harder. And the bird was kicking and trying to struggle, but his mouth was over its neck, and then the top of its head, and he was biting hard like on some huge walnut or something. And then, eventually, there was this horrible crack and, well, the bird stopped moving. Mr. Blackwell was understandably something of a local bogeyman. He also kept foxglove in his garden. The foxglove plant, the flowers of which grow with beautiful purplish bell shapes, are toxic if eaten, and can even be damaging if the toxins are absorbed through the skin. It's for this reason that it is also sometimes referred to as a witch's glove. I had retained this curious bit of botanical knowledge because only a few months earlier my father, a keen gardener, had warned both Dawn and myself about the plant and its properties. He had shared this warning, forbidding us to touch it when Dawn had pointed out the pretty flowers growing in Mr. Blackwell's garden. My father had mentioned how strange it was to see the plant growing in someone's garden and said that he would speak to Mr. Blackwell about it. I remembered seeing Dawn's tiny hands reaching out toward that flower and my father stepping in front to stop her from touching it. I remembered and replayed that detail over and over, her pudgy little fingers so close to danger, and remembered seeing also, peering through the window and partially obscured by the net curtain, the hard old face of Mr. Blackwell watching. A strange little smile, humorless and cruel, curling up the corners of his mouth and showing below a row of ivory-coloured teeth. Teeth that, in my memory at least, looked horribly and unusually sharp. As soon as I read those words, I knew I had to go there. But not that night. Whilst I wanted to go, even despite my fear, to that house immediately, to that horrible garden that scared the local children, I knew I had to wait. I would need to go there, but I would also need to be prepared, and that meant making another stop along the way. So I waited, and the following night I crept out again for my second break-in of the week.